Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I wanted to welcome Justine Bello. She's an architectural conservator and has presented before for CHRS. And so I know this is a really interesting presentation. So I'm really excited that she's able to join us and share her expertise. And I think that's all the introduction. I'll let Justine introduce herself, say more about where she's from and what she does, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, Justine, for joining us.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Let me go ahead and get this queued up. All right. Hopefully you're now seeing as full as full a screen as my computer will allow tonight. Am I good, Chris?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. So yeah, as Chris said, Justine Bello. I'm an architectural conservator, which means I'm primarily interested in understanding how buildings fall apart and how to find ways to repair them. And I'm a 10-year resident of Capitol Hill. I work for the National Park Service currently, although I'm here solely in my capacity as a individual and as a lover of buildings. And I have spoken to the CHRS family about the ghost of Capitol Hill several years ago. I've tried to bring some little bit of new information, some new images to this, and just find it a really fun conversation to have about how we can all refresh our own lenses for how we look at this place that we call home. So particularly because this is a small group. Chris, I hope it's okay for me to encourage folks if they have questions as we're going to please just go ahead and throw them at me. I don't think we need to wait for the end if that's okay with you all.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So I will go ahead and get us started. So the my whole predication of this talk is really the idea that ghosts are all around us, and as I'm sure you can intuit from the nature of this talk, we're not talking about ghosts of the supernatural sense. We're talking about ghosts of the architectural sense. And when we're speaking about that, we're thinking about uh, physical clues that indicate the way a building used to be or some change over time. And that can range both from very, very small details to very, very large ones, both vernacular buildings and really grand buildings. Speaking of vernacular, this is quite an old photo now of the shotgun house, which obviously does not look like this and hasn't looked like this for quite some time, but is just one of my most favorite pictures of a vernacular building in our neighborhood. So I keep it in just because. So when we're talking about architectural ghosts, I really offer this more as a toolkit than a missive of specific information. And so what I really encourage is trying to arm everybody with tools that I think will help everybody be able to interact with and experience these ghosts, similar to how I do. So although Chris very kindly alluded to expertise, I really think it's critical to build a culture of awareness over expertise to enrich our architectural vocabulary and then to find ways to put it into practice. And so this talk will take this three-prong approach through the subject. So I say this all the time, and I think it's probably something that I'm known for at this point, but I really strongly believe you do not need to be an expert to understand buildings. I think anyone who tries to to sell that is selling themselves and selling all of you short. These buildings are all around with us. We interact with them in so many different ways all the time, and I think by just employing some of the skills that we're going to talk about today, there's so many ways that we can be enjoying them and really deepening this relationship that we have with them in a way that doesn't have to be so proprietary. So I would argue that reading a building in some ways starts with being able to read a map. And for those of us who have lived in Washington, D.C. in particular for a long time, we know that we have both a rich history of maps as primary documents, but also that we that our grid system has perpetuated the streets and squares and lots that haven't changed terribly over the years. And we see this from 1800 to the Sanborn fire insurance maps of the 1880s and the early 20th century, even through our ArcGIS systems today. And this makes it really, it lends just such a robust architecture to our ability to understand buildings over time, because this framework has been so consistent throughout. So it's incredible, really, that this street system is it's just telegraphed in the exact same way throughout all these maps. The geometry is so precise and so pure. Again, on the city scale, on the block scale, and then even on the lot and building scale. So I wanted to just take a moment. I'm sure many of us here are familiar with the Sanborn fire insurance maps, but they can be such a great place to start. I think the 1888 maps that are available through the Library of Congress are a really, really rich resource, because it really aligns with when a lot of the buildings in our neighborhood were first showing up. So being able to compare maps before and slightly after helps us understand change over time. But just these simple maps provide such a great clue, as easy as consulting the key that's provided on the first page, and then understanding what's a frame building, what's a brick building. It even goes as far as telling us which are those brick buildings with metal cornices, which is such a lovely detail. And then being able to take that and compare it with what we have today, there's such, again, remarkable consistency. And I'll speak for myself that it's incredibly gratifying when you start to correlate your primary document resources with what you're seeing on the ground in the field and making these connections. I'm going to use the word thrilling. I don't know if everybody would use that word thrilling, but I find it quite thrilling. So being able to see, okay, cluster of buildings here we go. Even the simple, not even quite an alley, but airspace between the buildings there presents in real life here. And this cluster of 3 frame buildings here, we get to see again today. So again, starting by reading a map and reading a building, there's so much great information to be gleaned in that relationship there. So when we're talking about reading a building, I really do think that we can be quite as literal as reading a building. This is not an abstract idea, but actually taking a moment, stepping back sometimes far enough within an alley or across the street to be able to say, what's actually there? And being able to tease out, the letters of former signage, telling you what was a previous use of that space. So laundry here in this case. This is actually over in Shaw, so please forgive me for straying outside the neighborhood. But this motor car company, which is, again, it often takes just a little bit of time and a little bit of perspective to be able to kind of have it come into focus, but really, truly just hidden in plain view this entire time. Reading a building can also involve looking at maker's marks. Cast iron is one of the best candidates to offer information such as that. So this can often provide information both about the forge from which it came, as well as the year in which it was fabricated, sometimes a builder that might be involved as well. One of these examples that I absolutely love is actually one that distinguishes the date of a restoration, which is so incredibly helpful. That's something that can become visually confusing. Without this information, we might, particularly if it's a very well done restoration, we might look at the ironwork and assume that it's original. And having this information right there is just so valuable for being able to interpolate the differences between historic and a really, really good restoration. So, reading a building, I think it's also really important to consider them in context, particularly because we have the benefit of row houses. Considering one within considering one on its own can be a little bit narrow. And so again, stepping back, stepping across the street and understanding what is the relationship between these buildings helps us see patterns and also there see differences. So not only do we notice the absence of porches physically on the two row houses to the right compared to the ones that are on the left, we can also, when we look a little bit closer, see the ghosts of these porches that had been once removed. So you can see the brick is slightly scarified. We may even see some beam pockets that were there. Of course, this has all been painted over as well, which helps to disguise some of it. But again, looking at the buildings in context is a great way. Looking at your neighbor to the right and to the left is probably going to tell you something about the house in the middle as well. So that's the area in there that we're speaking about. Here's a similar example. We have a house that's sandwiched between two with porches, and we can see pretty clearly in here the remnants of some joists that were left just remaining in the wall and painted over. That's another thing to just point out about typical human behavior. This is true for really time immemorial. We humans are not great about cleaning up our trash, and we tend to leave stuff in place more often than moving it away. This is one of the reasons that trash heaps are such rich archaeological finds. Human trash is just truly one of the great deposits of information. So again, sometimes just hidden in plain view because humans are so likely to leave their little nuggets behind. They're really there if you take a moment to look at them. Openings are maybe among the most likely candidates of a building that are going to change. They can offer great opportunity in terms of access and circulation. They can also be very limiting in terms of wall space and how you want to subdivide the interior. So understanding how openings have been infilled over the years can definitely tell you about change over time. And those are among the most pronounced because they, again, humans often look for the path of least resistance. So while it would have been, perhaps visually more appealing if someone had taken the time to say tooth in new brickwork to make this opening or the filling of this opening less visible, the fact that they didn't actually tells us information about what had been there previously. And there's no right or wrong way, they're just different. This is not quite so prevalent in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, but there's also a culture of uh, hiding one surface with another. We have a rare instance of on the left of something that's sort of akin to formstone, which for those that are familiar with Baltimore architecture is very, very prevalent there. And then on the right, some vinyl siding. Again, neither of these would have been original. They would have been an attempt at some point to provide a new, maybe more visually appealing finish, potentially to hide some sins underneath as well. But what we move toward at some point is usually they don't stay on forever. And as we're presented with these different surfaces, it can be very visually confusing. And unfortunately, this is maybe the most ill-advised of ways to try to um, visually alter a building, usually because the covering material tends to engender deterioration of the material underneath. Um, That said, there can be really, really worthwhile work that's undertaken and time consuming and meticulous to reveal and ultimately restore that original finish underneath. These are a couple of my favorite examples. The one on the left is on Florida Avenue. Again, of this formstone type of finish, but you can see that they were not they were just not super complete in their application of it. There had been an existing porch and just found a way to work around it. And so when the porch came down, the original brick facade underneath shines through. And same thing with the one on the right. The one on the right is fascinating to me because they've actually chosen to uh, sort of reveal the brick in a more thoughtful, articulated way, as well as preserve the formstone above at the same time. Um, again, this could be visually confusing to some, but if you spend a moment and look at it, I think the intent comes through, and I think it's actually quite an interesting way to try to interpret the different finishes over time. Also, a way to perhaps honor the formstone rather than treat it as a sacrificial material. So. It's an alternative. I think it's actually one of the better ways that this material has been approached. Another one on Florida Avenue where the vinyl siding is probably revealing itself over time. I don't know that this was done intentionally, but we can start to see, this wonderful decorative brickwork, these embossed areas up at the top, and the coins over the windows. So hard to say what the rest of the condition underlying this is. But again, something that reveals itself, particularly when you stand a few feet back. Similar to the formstone painting, there's certainly been a rush of painting row houses over the last several decades. And again, like with many things, folks tend to be unlikely to move things that might be in the way. So when ultimately something like a shutter does fall off, we see that the ghost of the shutter there telegraphed. Because I can't resist, I must always urge that if you can, maybe please don't paint your row house. It does often engender, again, deterioration of both the brick and the mortar underneath. Thank you for putting up with yet another one of my PSAs about this. This is not in every case, and this is certainly a much more advanced condition on the right, but I would love for that not to happen to anybody on this call tonight. So that's a little bit of a foray into reading what's pretty plainly put in front of us. I think the next step then is building a vocabulary for either conditions or building components that might be a little less intuitive and might require a little bit more information to help you with interpretation. And so we'll talk a little bit about that vocabulary now. So this is an example that we do see fairly frequently across the neighborhood. These very, very small, well, very, very narrow windows, I should say, that are all of a particular height. Again, it may not be intuitive what they are or why they look the way that they do. But for for those who maybe haven't known before, these are stable windows that are of a particular height because they serve a particular function for a particular occupant and user. So the one on the left is off of 12th Street Southeast, I believe, and the one on the right, this one actually no longer looks quite like this. This is off of 6th Street Northeast, forgive me. But both have the stable window typology. Here's another example here that was actually being revealed when a building that didn't exactly share a party wall but had been adjoining was being torn down in front of it. So another pretty common vocabulary item is this beam that we tend to see over second story doors. Here are two examples we're talking about there, which is a hoist beam and would have been used to be able to have a winch and or a pulley and hoist materials up to the second floor of stables or similar types of buildings through that again through that large second story opening. And some alleys are they're quite common. You can look down an entire row and see them. Again, not functional any longer in any situations that I'm aware of, but do give some context to what these buildings had been used for originally. How many? And so certainly both of these examples also point to the fact that there sure are a lot of stables, and that is true. And I couldn't do any of this without the DC alley survey that I'm sure many on the call are familiar with. Such a robust document that has served the neighborhood, our neighborhood, but also neighborhoods outside of Capitol Hill. Certainly, buildings or alley buildings were really, really well represented in this neighborhood. But it's an invaluable document for understanding both the quantity, the variety, the social conditions that led to the original generation of these buildings, but also how they've evolved over time. More common on interior surfaces are beam pockets that would have told us information about either a different floor or ceiling height. These tend to, again, be left in place, particularly as, excuse me, as exposed brick finishes have been very in vogue for the last several decades at this point. So these are, again, often just abandoned, but not and non-functional, but also don't detract from the integrity of the building in any way. And again, with a little bit of interpolation, can provide some information about what was a different, well, what the building looked like at a different time. And so where this is all leading is then trying to take some of this into practice. Again, thinking about this as more of a skill set than a knowledge base. So being in a situation presented with a building that has all of the things that we've been talking about, different openings, beam pockets, finishes, gives us an opportunity to take a look at it and try to think about what might have been going on here originally. So this was a building on 17th Place Northeast, which has since been torn down. I managed to get this photo in the middle of its demolition, but I think this is just such an instructive example. You have everything from the ghost of different stairways. You've got your joist pockets here telling us information about different floor heights. You've got all kinds of different plaster and paint interior finishes. So just a wealth of information on, what is truly just a two-dimensional wall here. It really helps you realize what this building could have looked like in 3 dimensions. Transoms are another great one. I happen to see lots of different ways that these change over time. And again, combining information about looking at your neighbors, looking to one side or the other, and also having just a little bit of information about what that window would have done originally can help us figure out when something has changed over time. Another situation here where, again, because humans love to just abandon things where they are, you can see that this this fence here has migrated inward. They simply lobbed off what had been, what remained of the original wrought iron fence that was set in the concrete, and then just moved the new fence inward. So those are our little remnants, our little skeleton there. Another example here of just looking at a combination both of actual text on a building that allows us to read what's going on, both here and here. And then the architectural ghost, this is tar that was left over from the roof of a neighboring building. So that ghost tells us about a structure that had been adjacent and no longer exists. Excuse me for as I take just a quick sip of water. So just to bring it back, to the idea that ghosts are all around us. Again, these have been more of our vernacular examples that we're looking for in our own neighborhoods, our own homes, perhaps. Certainly, there are plenty of examples that are in more significant, more well-known buildings, and I wanted to just highlight a few of those and how they've changed over time as well. I think many of us are probably familiar with the old Naval Hospital on Pennsylvania Avenue, now the Hill Center. This is one from which we have a tremendous amount of primary document information, including photographs, which has been so fantastic in the meticulous restoration that was carried out a number of years ago. From photos to postcards. And this is a situation where paint finishes were brought back. We had such strong documentary evidence to support that that it actually was so beautifully employed here, and it articulates the building in such a spectacular way that made it for a really, really well-founded restoration. The Commandant's House on Barracks Row is another one that has changed a ton over time, but has been there for longer than almost any other building in the entire city. As we know, it's one of the few that did survive the burning of DC in the War of 1812. And although it was quite humble and modest, as you see it in the right side of this photograph here, looking over the yards, again, we do have some documentary evidence that shows how it changes over time. How it looks today, at least on as it presents to the street, but it has gotten there with some more than just documentary evidence too. This is a situation where more specialized investigation was ultimately undertaken in the way of paint sampling and mortar sampling and analysis to be able to understand with a lot of specificity, things like maps and photos can help us establish a general sequence, but they often aren't enough to fill in all of the details. So we like this situation when we can, it's wonderful to be able to cross-reference both your primary documentary evidence along with primary evidence from the building itself. So here, both the photographs and the material analysis support and cross-reference and corroborate one another. So what you're looking at here in the lower right-hand corner is a paint stratigraphy that was established by sampling down to brick. So we establish our starting point by making sure that we capture some of the brick substrate in the sample, knowing that that's our starting point. And then looking at the strata as it builds up over time. Again, because people are unlikely to remove the underlying paint before they apply new, we end up with a fairly complete record of how the building was painted over the course of generations. So it's a little hard to see in this photo just because we're not zoomed in as far as I would like to be, but ended up with I think 12 to 14 different layers of paint, and we're able to understand especially when we take it in the greater context of understanding changes in paint preferences and fashion over time. It might seem counterintuitive that brick would have been painted brick color, but indeed it was. Now, we certainly also can support the curatorial decision that the commandant made not to return the house to that original color. This is information, but again, there's no good color or bad color. It's just different. So in this situation, they opted not to return it to its original finish, which is different from the choice that was made at the old Naval Hospital, which again is up to the owner and would support either of those options. the Bullfinch Gates Post and Gatehouse, maybe some of the most misunderstood and maybe mystifying parts of downtown DC, particularly to visitors. We know that these were part of early iteration of the US Capitol grounds, and that over time they have migrated to different parts of the city. Certainly there are some at the, some at the Arboretum on New York Avenue, and some have found their way downtown as well. A little unfortunate that they are there without any contextual information to provide interpretation to the visitors. I usually see folks leaning against them while they're waiting for a bus, but in the future, it would be wonderful if there was some way for folks to know in the moment what they are looking at and standing next to, and where they started and how they got there. The US Capitol East Portico, as we know, this building has changed numerous times in many major ways. The East Capitol, or sorry, the East Portico that we see here was the one that was in place at the time of Lincoln's inauguration. We're seeing a photograph from this here. Just for a tangent, or some folks may have seen this photo previously, but we do know now that John Wilkes Booth was both at that event and has been positively identified since then. But those columns are now at the Arboretum. They're in various states of disaggregation. Different types of stones were used to support different areas of construction at the Capitol. And so for conservators like me, we're fascinated by that micro level of detail. So even a building as monumental as the Capitol is not deteriorating in the same way consistently around the structure, because different materials were used in different building campaigns. So a lot that we can learn about the construction of a building through the way that we see it start to deteriorate. And photos that really won't be relevant for much longer. We know that some of these stones also have ended up at Rock Creek Park, where they've been, I believe, since the 1970s. But as some of you may have read recently, they are they are in the works of starting to move them out of the park over time, although the property does belong to architect of the Capitol. The National Park Service has a surplus of land in the city that the AOC does not have, and they have been finding a home here. But we know that they have been fenced off for the last couple of years, as well as DC's best hidden secret no longer became so well hidden. So I just want to say thanks. You know, I really find this to be a fun conversation, and I want to share that just before this meeting, Elizabeth shared a wonderful photo that she took on an alley walk recently of a building that I have never even seen before, and has inspired me to go back and take a look at it. So I'm always learning through walks through our neighborhood, and hope that you all are enjoying the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justine. Do we have any questions?
I have. Can we go to your very first introductory slide where you show 3 levels of a house?
Yes.
Yes, that one.
That one.
Now, at the lowest level, you've got some numbers. What are the significance of those numbers? They don't seem to be in order.
That's a great question. You know, because this was already in the process of demolition when I took this photo, I intuited that perhaps it had something to do with their demolition process, but I don't know that for sure. So that's a great question, and one that actually remains unresolved.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
I have a question. You discussed, I think you called it the Bullfinch Gate.
Yes.
And can you please tell the story and give the context behind those?
Sure. So in this original early, but a very, very, very early layout of the Capitol grounds, these gate posts, gatehouses and gate posts were stationed at different locations. So you're seeing one down here, one down here, effectively to mark, really to mark out the borders of the Capitol grounds, and they have been, as they became outmoded and as the Capitol grounds have changed over time, by subsequent landscape architects, they were phased out. I believe in the Olmsted years, that was more of that was a later 19th century intervention. What we see today is very much the Olmsted vision of the Capitol grounds, and so these slightly more traditional ones were distributed throughout the city after that.
It looks like, I mean, were they disassembled and then rebuilt in some other location? If you go back one slide for a
Sure.
picture, they would have to have been.
Yeah, I would suspect that they would. We separately from more as part of my professional work, we have been looking at the gateposts in particular. They are not faring well in this location. They were not designed to be subjected to both this level of handling. You can actually see pretty clearly that the worst deterioration tends to be at human height, where people are the most likely to lean against it, to touch it, to poke at it and prod it. And also there's such terrible commuter pollution down here. That's a lot of that dark soiling that we're seeing here is deposits from the buses and from car traffic down here. This type of sandstone is just, they have also found over the years, is not particularly robust. And that was not something that they would have necessarily known at the time, Sequoia sandstone. That quarry closed quite a long time ago, but a lot of our early DC buildings have Sequoia sandstone in them. Unfortunately, it's just not fared well over the years. So they're really struggling in this location in particular.
Thank you.
Ken, I see that you have a question.
Just a quick one, that last slide, where is it from?
Yeah, this is actually Davis, West Virginia. So I strayed pretty far outside of Capitol Hill on that one. But it's just a mail pouch, if folks are familiar with the, I believe it's chewing tobacco. It just happened to be such a huge sign on this building, and just a great example of a really, really big ghost.
Great, thanks.
Sure, thank you.
I think there was also a question about that from the in the chat.
Yeah, a great town to visit if anybody hasn't been there already.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the town?
It's Davis, West
Davis.
Virginia.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, yeah, it's a Canaan Valley area.
Justine, there was I had a question. This is Chris. I had a when we had some damage done to our house during a storm a couple years ago, and we ended up removing some of the plaster and the paint from one of the bedrooms, and there was a black tar underneath, which I at first was sure there had been a fire in there and it had created the soot or something, but it turned out to be tar. I don't know if you have any experience with that. I noticed that one of your pictures, I wasn't sure if it was painted black or if it also had the tar that we discovered.
Yes, Chris, that's a really interesting question. So here, I think it likely was painted, but I don't know for that for sure. But a lot of times when that is encountered, it tends to be an early iteration of an attempt to provide a waterproofing surface on the brick. We know now that those tend to actually trap moisture in the brick rather than keep it out. So a lot of those tend to flake off and fail. But you're right, it is a very tar-like substance, and it tends to get quite brittle over the years. And so if you tap on it with your nails, you may often find that it may be blistered or crack again, because there usually is some deterioration of the brick behind it. But usually that's what it is. It was some sort of waterproofing, early waterproofing bituminous coating.
Yeah, it was really awful and it smelled horrible. We tried to get it off, just like you said, tapping on it. It was coming off, but it was.
Yeah. I have seen that done there. There are actually quite novel ways that has been removed from other locations. I've seen it actually removed through what's called dry ice blasting. So it's actually CO2 pellets there's a whole system where you have a hopper, and there's essentially like a nozzle that you can change the pressure, and folks who are trained in it can blast it off. Similar to the sandblasting that we used to hear about 30 to 40 years ago, but that aren't prescribed now. There are some interesting advantages to it, in that there's a high level of precision that you can achieve with this that we couldn't achieve with sandblasting, or 30 or 40 years ago, and has been proved to be extremely useful on materials just like that. Some considerations though, such as that it's not necessarily safe to use indoors, because when they evaporate, or when they sublime, I guess, all this CO2 gas is given off. So lots of considerations as usual.
Do they use that to remove paint as well, or is it just the tar?
That's interesting. I haven't heard it indicated so much for paint. But I have heard it. Now that I say that, there certainly are other coatings. I would say certainly there are coatings in general. Paint. There are so many other ways to remove paint that it's probably not the most cost-effective way to do it. But for something, as you demonstrated, it is very, very difficult to remove, particularly to remove and not take the brick with it. You may have found, Chris, as you were trying to take it off, that some of the brick faces may have been coming off with it, and that's what this method of removal actually allows you to avoid.
Yeah. Are there more questions? Hearing none. I guess we will end it here then. If we don't have any more questions, thank you all for your participation, and for Justine for a great presentation. I always enjoy this. I love all the pictures, and ever since you presented a couple years ago, I've never walked down the street on Capitol Hill the same way, because I'm always looking for things. And even I was in an alleyway, and there were a bunch of kids playing in the alley, and I started talking about how the horses would I was pointing out there was obviously a stable, which you had found in your walks, with the windows and the lifter thing. I can't remember what it's called. And for the hay to go up. And then anyway, the kids were just fascinated. It was really fun to talk about that. So thank you so much for presenting.
Thank you, Justine.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And we will be taking a little bit of a hiatus during December for the holidays, but we will be presenting again a Preservation Cafe in January on the story behind our DC schools on January 17th. So we hope that you can join us for that. And again, as Elizabeth had mentioned earlier, send your photos in for the photo contest. Even if you're not interested in winning, but we all have a competitive streak. The photos are terrific, and she'll put them on the Instagram and that sort of thing. So thank you so much for participating in that. And with that, we will end it here. Thank you all again for joining us. And thanks, Justine. Have a great rest of the evening.